the version of my life that everyone in Harmony Creek believed, we didn't lock our doors. We left apple pies on windowsills to cool, their sweet cinnamon breath mingling with the scent of freshly cut grass and blooming roses. We believed goodness was like the Oregon air we breathed. It was just there, a fundamental part of our world, clean and abundant and free for all. In that town, a place seemingly preserved in the golden amber of a bygone era, Jacob Abernathy was the best of us. He was the standard against which all other men were measured and found wanting, or so everyone thought. I'm 75 years old now. My hands, spotted with age and traced with the fine blue map of my veins, hold a small porcelain bird. Its painted eyes are glossy and black, forever fixed on a world that no longer exists. Outside my window, a gentle rain is falling, tapping against the glass like a patient memory. It was on a day much like this, full of deceptive peace, that the story truly began. The first time he laid his hands on me, he told me it was a secret, a special bond between us. For a long time, the lie I held onto wasn't that he was a monster, that truth was too vast and terrifying for a 16-year-old girl to comprehend. No, the lie I clung to, with the desperation of a drowning child, was that my parents would save me from him. That was the most painful lie of all, the one that left the deepest scar. It was the heart of a long, lazy summer, the kind that felt as if it would stretch on forever. The sun was a warm, heavy blanket over Harmony Creek, and the drone of lawnmowers was our town's anthem. Our street, Elm Avenue, was a perfect postcard of suburban bliss. Each house was a variation on a theme, neat clapboard siding and pastels of yellow, blue, and mint green, porches adorned with hanging ferns and wicker chairs, and gardens that erupted in riots of color, hydrangeas, petunias, and my mother's prize-winning roses. It was a world built on order, on the unspoken covenant that if you tended your lawn and painted your fence and smiled at your neighbors, nothing truly bad could ever touch you. We mistook neatness for goodness. My world at 16 was small and intensely controlled. My parents, David and Mary Clark, were devout followers of a strict moral code, one that valued appearance, piety, and obedience above all else. My father was a manager at the local timber mill, a man whose spine seemed to be forged from the unyielding Oregon firs he processed. My mother was the architect of our domestic life, a woman who could find a speck of dust in a sunbeam and saw sin in a hemline that was an inch too high. They loved me, I believe, in the only way they knew how, by trying to mold me into a perfect reflection of their values, a testament to their righteous parenting. But their love felt like a cage, gilded and safe, but a cage nonetheless. I was a daydreamer, a girl who found more solace in the pages of a book than in the rigid pews of our church, and this quiet rebellion was a constant source of friction. That afternoon, I was fighting with my bicycle. The chain had slipped off the sprocket, and my fingers were slick with grease and frustration. It was an old, heavy machine, a hand-me-down that had been my mother's, and its mechanics were a mystery to me. I knelt on the sidewalk, the sun hot on the back of my neck, poking uselessly at the greasy links. It was a simple, childish problem, the kind you could still believe was the worst thing that could happen to you in a day. "Trouble in paradise, lily flower?" The voice was smooth and warm, like honeyed whiskey. I looked up, squinting into the sun. Jacob Abernathy stood there, wiping his hands on a clean rag. He'd been tending to the prize-winning orchids in his greenhouse, a glass-paned jewel box that shimmered at the back of his property. His house was next to ours, a pristine white colonial that was the undisputed crown jewel of Elm Avenue. His lawn was a perfect emerald carpet. His hedges were sculpted into immaculate green walls, and not a single weed dared to sprout in his flower beds. He was a widower, his wife having passed from a sudden illness some years before I was old enough to remember her clearly, and the town had wrapped him in a cloak of gentle sympathy ever since. He was handsome in the way of old movie stars, with silvering temples, a strong jaw, and eyes the color of a clear summer sky. "The chain fell off," I mumbled, feeling clumsy and childish under his confident gaze. My cheeks flushed with a mix of embarrassment and the heat. "An age-old dilemma," he chuckled. "Let an old hand take a look." He knelt beside me, his presence immediately calming the frantic energy of my struggle. He didn't seem to mind the grease. With a few deft, knowing movements, he coaxed the chain back onto the teeth of the sprocket. It was done in moments. His hands were clean and strong, the nails perfectly manicured, and as he worked, his knuckles brushed against mine. It wasn't a lingering touch, not one that could be called improper, but it sent a strange, unfamiliar jolt through me. It was a spark of something adult, something I didn't have a name for. "There you go," he said, spinning the pedal to test the chain. The whirring sound was crisp and satisfying. "Good as new." He stood up, offering me a hand. I took it, and he pulled me to my feet with effortless strength. He held my hand for a fraction of a second longer than necessary, his thumb brushing over my pulse point. He then gave me a conspiratorial wink. "Don't let these modern contraptions get the best of you." From our porch, I could feel the beaming approval of my parents. They were sitting in their wicker chairs, a pitcher of iced tea between them, watching the entire exchange. Their posture, which was usually ramrod straight, seemed to soften in Mr. Abernathy's presence. "Such a gentleman, that Mr. Abernathy," I heard my mother say to my father, her voice carrying on the still air. It was a tone she usually reserved for the pastor after a particularly moving sermon. A true blessing to this neighborhood. My father, a man not given to easy praise, nodded in solemn agreement. He keeps to himself, but he's a good man. Solid, knows the value of a hard day's work. To my father, this was the highest of compliments. Mr. Abernathy was a success. He'd retired young from some lucrative but vaguely defined business in the city, and now he dedicated his time to his garden, his home, and his role as a respected elder at our church. He was everything my parents aspired to be, prosperous, respected, and unblemished by scandal or gossip. He was the living embodiment of the rewards of a righteous life. Mr. Abernathy gave a modest wave toward my parents, his smile never faltering. "Just helping a neighbor, Mary." It's what we do here in Harmony Creek. He was woven into the fabric of our community in a way that seemed both profound and effortless. At the annual 4th of July block party, it was his brisket that people lined up for, when old Mrs. Gable down the street had a plumbing emergency. It was Mr. Abernathy who knew a reliable man to call and paid for the repair himself, refusing any offer of repayment. At church, he didn't just donate generously. He sat on the finance committee, his quiet wisdom guiding the church's investments and ensuring its stability. He had a way of making everyone feel seen and valued, of offering a kind word or a piece of sage advice that felt both personal and profound. He was a pillar. He was unimpeachable. His smile was a carefully constructed fence, and none of us ever thought to ask what he was hiding behind it. I mumbled my thanks, my eyes fixed on the now perfectly aligned chain of my bicycle. I felt a confusing swirl of emotions, gratitude for his help, a strange flutter of pride at having earned his attention, and beneath it all, a tiny, inexplicable seed of unease. It was the way he'd called me Lily Flower, a name no one else used, as if I were one of the delicate, cultivated blossoms in his garden. It was the way his gaze seemed to hold mine for a moment too long, making me feel seen in a way that was different from how my parents, or my teachers, or the boys at school saw me. "You take care now," he said, his voice dropping to a more intimate register. He gave a final nod, turned, and walked back across his perfect lawn, disappearing into the cool shadow of his perfect front door. I stood there for a long moment, the heat of the sun on my skin, the smell of grease on my hands. The world was exactly as it had been 5 minutes before. The sprinklers still whispered across the neighboring lawns. A dog barked in the distance. My mother's wind chimes sang a tinny melody from the porch. Nothing had changed, but something had shifted inside me, a tiny tremor along a fault line I never knew existed. "Lily, dinner!" my mother's voice called out sharp and clear, pulling me back to reality. "And wash that filth off your hands before you come to the table." I pushed my bicycle toward our garage, the wheels spinning smoothly now. As I closed the heavy wooden door, plunging the space into a dusty twilight, I glanced back at Mr. Abernathy's house. For a second, I thought I saw a shadow move in the upstairs window, a figure watching from behind the pristine lace curtains. But it was gone as quickly as I saw it, likely just a trick of the light, a reflection of a passing cloud. I went inside and washed my hands until they were raw, scrubbing away the black grease, trying to erase the ghost of his touch and the unsettling feeling that had coiled in the pit of my stomach. At the dinner table, my parents spoke of him with reverence. They talked about his generosity to the church's new building fund, about the quiet dignity with which he carried his loneliness. I ate my meatloaf and mashed potatoes in silence, the porcelain bird of my innocence sitting on a ledge within me, not yet knowing it was about to be pushed. The weeks that followed were a masterclass in deception, though I wouldn't have the words for it for another 50 years. The memory of Mr. Abernathy's touch, that brief weighted pressure on my wrist, faded from a sharp jolt to a dull, confusing echo. He didn't press, he retreated. He became once again the perfect neighbor, but now his perfection was aimed more directly at me. It was in the small, almost imperceptible gestures, a wave from his porch that seemed meant only for me, even when my father was standing right beside me. A compliment delivered to my mother about her garden, followed by a quick, smiling glance in my direction, as if to include me in a secret circle of approval. One morning, we found a small wicker basket on our doorstep, filled with the most beautiful ruby-red tomatoes from his vine, a sprig of basil laid carefully on top. "He is the soul of generosity," my mother had declared, carrying the basket into the kitchen as if it were a holy relic. I began to feel as though I were a fish swimming in a placid pond, unaware of the patient fishermen on the bank, occasionally tossing in breadcrumbs to draw me closer. Each small kindness was a breadcrumb. Each warm smile, each shared glance, was designed to quell the tiny, instinctive unease I had felt and replace it with a sense of being special. He was a pillar of the community, a friend to my parents, a lonely man of God. What could I possibly have to fear from him? The thought felt like a betrayal, not of him, but of the entire world my parents had built around me. A world where good men were good and danger was something that happened elsewhere, to other people. The invitation came on a sweltering afternoon in late July. I was sitting on the front porch steps, languid with boredom, watching heat shimmer above the asphalt of the street. My parents had gone to a church committee meeting, leaving me with strict instructions to weed the flower beds, a task I was studiously ignoring. Mr. Abernathy emerged from his house, carrying a watering can. He paused at the edge of his lawn, as if just noticing me. "A day for quiet contemplation, Lily Flower?" he asked, his voice a welcome interruption to the monotonous buzz of the cicadas. I shrugged, feeling my face flush slightly. "It's too hot to move." He smiled, a gentle, paternal expression. "I know the feeling. On days like this, I retreat to my workshop. It's the coolest place on the property." He took a few steps closer, lowering his voice. "You know, I've been meaning to show you my collection. Not many people appreciate the craft anymore, but I've always thought you had an artist's soul." "You're observant." His words were another breadcrumb, and I devoured it eagerly. To be 16 is to be a bottomless pit of need, the need to be seen, to be understood, to be considered something more than just a child. My parents saw me as a vessel to be filled with their rules. Mr. Abernathy saw an artist's soul. "Your collection?" I asked, my curiosity piqued. "Ship models," he said, his eyes lighting up with genuine passion. "I build them myself, replicas of the great vessels. The Cuddy Sark, the USS Constitution. They're my pride and joy." He gestured toward his garage, the large white door gleaming in the sun. "I'm just putting the finishing touches on a Spanish galleon. Would you care to see?" The request felt so wholesome, so completely innocent. It was the kind of invitation a grandfather extends to a grandchild. To refuse would have been rude, an insult to his kindness. It would have been inexplicable. "Okay," I said, getting to my feet. "Sure. Wonderful." His smile broadened. "Let's escape this heat." I followed him across the small stretch of lawn that separated our properties. It was a no-man's land I had crossed 1,000 times, but this time it felt different, as if I were stepping from my world into his. The air in his garage, as he heaved open the heavy main door, was immediately cooler, carrying the rich, clean scent of sawdust, varnish, and damp earth. It was a cathedral of masculine hobbies. Tools hung in gleaming, orderly rows on a pegboard wall. Jars of screws, nails, and bolts were neatly labeled, and there, on a long workbench and on shelves lining the walls, were the ships. They were magnificent. Intricate rigging, no thicker than thread, rose from tiny, perfectly carved masts. The wooden decks were planked with painstaking precision. There were frigates and schooners and clippers, each a miniature masterpiece of patience and skill. I was genuinely impressed, my earlier unease forgotten entirely. "They're beautiful," I breathed, stepping closer to a large model of a ship with towering white sails. "That's the Flying Cloud," he said, his voice soft beside me. She set the world record for the fastest passage from New York to San Francisco, a true marvel of design. He led me through the collection, his voice a low, mesmerizing hum as he recounted the history of each vessel. He spoke of naval battles and trade routes, of storms on the high seas and the lonely lives of the men who sailed them. He was drawing me into his world, a world of history and craft and quiet passion. I felt special, privileged to be given this private tour. And then he led me to the back of the garage, to a workbench set under a single bare light bulb. Upon it sat the galleon, its skeleton-like frame only partially planked. "And this," he said, gesturing to it, "is my current project." He stood behind the workbench. I stood in front of it, effectively putting the long table between us and the rest of the garage. It was a subtle, tactical shift I didn't notice at the time. As I leaned in to admire the tiny carved cannons, he reached up and pulled the dangling cord that controlled the main garage door. The door rumbled down with a heavy final thud, plunging the garage into a sudden deep twilight. The bright, hot world of the afternoon vanished, silenced. The only illumination came from the single fly-specked bulb hanging over the workbench, casting long, distorted shadows that danced around us. The familiar, comforting sounds of the neighborhood, the distant traffic, the birdsong, the hum of life, were gone. All I could hear was the faint buzz of the light bulb and the sudden loud thumping of my own heart. "It's easier to see the details without the glare," he said. His voice had changed. The warm, avuncular tone was gone, replaced by something flatter, quieter. I straightened up, a cold knot of dread tightening in my stomach. The space, which had felt cozy in interesting moments before, now felt small and menacing. He was no longer on the other side of the workbench. He had moved around it and was standing near the only other exit, a small side door. He was between me and the light. He took a step toward me. "You're a special girl, Lily. You understand things other people don't." This wasn't a compliment anymore. It was an indictment. It was him telling me that I knew this was wrong and that I would keep quiet. I took a step back, my legs bumping into the hard edge of the workbench. "Trapped. I should probably go," I stammered, my voice sounding thin and weak. "My parents will be home soon." "They won't," he said calmly. "The meeting for the new pews is always a long one. We have time." His charm had evaporated completely, like water on a hot skillet. What was left was a chilling entitlement, a cold, appraising look in his eyes that I had never seen before. This was the real man, the one who lived behind the facade of the perfect neighbor. He moved closer, backing me against the workbench until the edge of it dug into my spine. "This will be our secret," he whispered, his voice a serpent's hiss in the silent garage. "A beautiful private thing." He raised a hand and gently, almost reverently, tucked a stray strand of my hair behind my ear. His touch was like ice. My entire body went rigid. I couldn't scream. The sound was frozen in my throat, a solid block of terror. It felt as if my soul had disconnected from my body, floating up toward the single dusty light bulb, watching the scene unfold from a great, helpless distance. "If you tell anyone," he continued, his face close to mine, his breath smelling faintly of coffee and something bitter, "you'll break your mother's heart. She has such pride in you, in this family. You wouldn't want to do that, would you? You wouldn't want to be the one to destroy her happiness?" His actions were swift then, brutal and efficient, a violation that was as much about power and silence as it was about the physical act. He pinned me against the rough wood, my mind shutting down, taking refuge in a blank white space of shock. I remember the splintery texture of the workbench against my back, the cold metallic smell of the tools hanging beside me, the horrifying realization that no one could hear me, that no one even knew where I was. The world had shrunk to this single terrifying point of contact, this dusty, shadowed space where goodness was a lie. When it was over, I was still frozen, unable to move, unable to breathe. He stepped back, and the speed with which he composed himself was the most terrifying thing of all. He smoothed his shirt, he adjusted his collar, the monster vanished, and Jacob Abernathy, the kind neighbor, returned. His expression was one of gentle concern, as if I were the one who had done something wrong, and he was the one offering forgiveness. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object. He pressed it into my limp, cold hand. "A gift," he said softly, "to remember our bond." I looked down. Lying in my palm was a small bird carved from a single piece of pale wood. It was smooth and delicate, its tiny wings half spread as if in mid-flight. Its perfection was an obscenity. He closed my fingers around it, his hand warm over mine. "Now," he said, his voice back to its normal, friendly tone, "you run along home, and remember, this is our secret, ours alone." He walked to the main door and heaved it open. The sudden explosion of sunlight was blinding, painful. The sounds of the world rushed back in, a car driving down the street, the laughter of children playing a few houses down. The ordinary, beautiful world was still there, completely untouched, completely unaware. I stumbled out of the garage, my legs unsteady, the wooden bird clutched in my fist so tightly its edges dug into my skin. I walked the few yards back to my own home in a daze, feeling like a ghost. I could see the living room through the picture window, the furniture sitting exactly where it was supposed to be. Nothing had changed. Everything had changed. I was a house that had been ransacked on the inside, while the outside remained perfectly pristine. I closed the front door behind me, the click of the latch sounding like a cell door locking, and leaned against it, my body finally starting to shake, the silent, ugly sobs beginning to tear their way out of my hollowed-out chest. In my hand, the bird was a hard, undeniable weight. It was the proof of my shame, the token of a bond I never wanted, the first brick in the wall of silence he would build around me. The human soul has a breaking point, but it doesn't always shatter into pieces. Sometimes it cracks, a fine hairline fracture that runs deep, invisible to the naked eye. From the outside, the form holds, the vessel appears intact. But inside, everything has changed. Light gets in differently, sounds are distorted. The vessel can no longer hold what it once did, not joy, not peace, not the simple, unthinking bliss of a summer afternoon. After that day in Mr. Abernathy's garage, I became a cracked vessel. I became a ghost in the landscape of my own life. I drifted through the hallways of my home, a silent specter in a house that was suddenly too loud, too bright, too full of the life I no longer felt a part of. The first few days were a blur of dissociation. I would find myself standing in the middle of a room with no memory of how I got there. Conversations happened around me, a muffled drone of words that I couldn't seem to grasp. At night, sleep was not a refuge, but a continuation of the horror. I didn't have linear nightmares. I had sensory fragments, the smell of sawdust and oil, the feeling of rough wood against my spine. The chilling sound of his voice, whispering that it was our secret. I would wake up with my heart hammering against my ribs, my throat tight with a scream that never came. The wooden bird was my tormentor. It was a physical manifestation of my silence, a tangible piece of the shame I carried. I couldn't throw it away. In my terror-addled mind, the bird was tied to the threat. To discard it felt like breaking the pact of silence, an act of defiance that would bring down the ruin he had promised upon my family. So I hid it. First, it was at the bottom of my sock drawer, a hard, unyielding shape against the soft, folded cotton. But I imagined my mother finding it while putting away laundry, her innocent question, "Oh, what's this, Lily? It's lovely. Where did you get it?" Sending me into a spiral of panic. I moved it to the back of my closet, tucked inside an old shoebox filled with forgotten childhood treasures. But its presence there felt like a contamination, its evil seeping into the good memories of a time before. Finally, I wedged it between the pages of a thick, rarely read copy of Moby Dick on my bookshelf. There, flattened between the dense paragraphs, it felt properly buried, its malignant energy contained by the weight of 1,000 pages. But I always knew it was there. The book sat on my shelf like a tombstone. My parents, blind architects of my cage, saw none of this. They saw only the symptoms, and they diagnosed the disease all wrong. They saw a quiet, sullen girl where a cheerful, obedient one had been. They saw defiance. They saw sin. My mother was the first to comment. We were at the dinner table, a few nights after the incident. I was pushing my potatoes around my plate, carving listless patterns in the gravy. The thought of swallowing, of forcing food down my tight throat, was nauseating. "Lily, for heaven's sake, eat your dinner," she said, her voice sharp with an impatience that had become her primary tone with me. "Your father worked hard to provide this meal. The least you can do is show a little gratitude." I flinched, picking up my fork with a trembling hand. "And stop moping," she continued, her lips pursed in a thin line of disapproval. "I don't know what's gotten into you lately, but this sullen attitude is unbecoming. It's ungrateful. We have been blessed with so much, and you walk around with a cloud over your head as if you've been wronged." The irony was so profound, so brutally painful, that a hysterical laugh almost bubbled up from my chest. I choked it down, my eyes burning with tears I refused to let fall. I had been wronged. I had been wronged in a way she couldn't possibly imagine, by the very man she held up as a paragon of virtue. But to say so would be to prove her right. It would bring shame. It would break her heart, just as he said it would. His words had become my reality. My grades, once a source of quiet pride for my parents, began to slip. I couldn't concentrate in class. The teacher's voice would fade into a meaningless drone as I stared out the window, my mind replaying the click of the garage door locking me in. My friends, Sarah and Jean, tried to pull me back into their world of boys and gossip and plans for the county fair. "What's wrong, Lily?" Jean asked one day at lunch, her brow furrowed with genuine concern. "You're a million miles away. Did you and your parents have a fight?" I just shook my head, unable to form words. How could I explain? How could I bridge the chasm that had opened up between my experience and theirs? Their biggest worry was whether Tommy Jensen would ask them for a dance. My biggest worry was the shadow I saw in my peripheral vision, the fear that Mr. Abernathy would appear around every corner. I started making excuses, avoiding their calls, until eventually they stopped calling. The isolation was a relief. It was easier to be alone than to pretend to be the girl I used to be. My father interpreted my retreat not as a symptom of pain, but as an act of willful rebellion. He saw my silence as defiance, my poor grades as laziness, my sadness as a moral failing. One evening he called me into the living room. He was holding my report card in his hand as if it were a piece of damning evidence. My mother sat on the sofa, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Explain this," my father commanded, his voice low and rumbling with anger. He wasn't yelling. He never yelled. His anger was a cold, immense pressure that filled the room. I don't know," I whispered, my eyes fixed on a point on the floral-patterned carpet. "You don't know," he repeated, his disbelief a palpable thing. "Disobedience is a sin, Lily. We raised you to be a light in this world, not a shadow. Whatever teenage rebellion you are indulging in, it ends now." The punishment was swift and, in his mind, just. I was grounded, indefinitely. My books, my only escape, were confiscated from my room, deemed a distraction from my duties and proper contemplation. My free time was to be spent on chores or in prayer. They were trying to scrub the stain of my supposed sin away, but all they were doing was scouring my soul raw. They were reinforcing the walls of my prison, brick by painful brick, and through it all, Mr. Abernathy watched. He was the smiling warden, the architect of my misery who was celebrated for his kindness. I would see him from my bedroom window, the one room where I was allowed to be alone. He'd be out in his garden, snipping a dead rose from a bush with surgical precision, or polishing his already gleaming sedan in the driveway. He would always, at some point, look up at my window, as if he knew I was there. He would raise a hand in a friendly wave, a slow, deliberate motion. It wasn't a greeting. It was a reminder. "I see you. I control you. Our secret is safe." The cruelest moments were when he interacted with my parents. He'd bring over a freshly baked loaf of bread, and my mother would gush with gratitude. He'd discuss local politics with my father over the picket fence, two pillars of the community sharing their wisdom. Once he even had the audacity to express his concern for me. "Is young Lily feeling all right, Mary?" he asked one afternoon as my mother was weeding her petunias. I was in the kitchen, within earshot, frozen, with my hand on the faucet. "She seems so quiet lately. I hope the pressures of school aren't getting to be too much for her." "Oh, you are so kind to ask, Jacob," my mother sighed, and I could picture her leaning against the fence, her guard completely down. "It's just teenage moods, I suppose. David and I are being firm with her. She needs structure." "She'll come around." "Of course she will," he said, his voice laced with false sympathy. "She's a wonderful girl, a true lily flower. Just needs a steady hand." I pressed my forehead against the cool glass of the kitchen window, my breath fogging the pain. He was using their love for me, their rigid, misguided sense of duty, as another weapon against me. He had not only silenced me, he had made my own parents his unwitting accomplices. They saw a rebellious daughter, but they were looking at a haunted house. They just couldn't see the ghost that rattled its chains in every room, the one he had put there. They were too busy trying to paint over the cracks to notice the foundations were crumbling. The seasons began to turn, a slow, inexorable shift that my own internal world refused to mirror. The oppressive heat of summer bled into the crisp, melancholic beauty of autumn. The leaves on the maple trees lining Elm Avenue turned from green to brilliant shades of fire, then drifted to the ground like dying embers. But within the walls of our house, and within the prison of my own mind, it was always the same stagnant, shadowed season. My grounding continued, a punishment for a crime my parents couldn't name, for a sadness they refused to understand. The silence stretched on, a vast, desolate landscape I navigated alone. Then, a new kind of silence began to grow inside me. It was a biological silence, a missed beat in the quiet, predictable rhythm of my own body. At first, I dismissed it. My life had been a chaotic mess of stress and fear. It was only natural that my body would be thrown off kilter. It was nothing. It had to be nothing. I repeated this mantra to myself in the dead of night, a desperate prayer to a God I was no longer on speaking terms with. "It's just stress. It will fix itself. Please, let it be nothing." Denial became my shield, a thin, brittle thing I held up against a dawning, unimaginable terror. The fatigue came next. It was a weariness that went bone deep, a leaden exhaustion that had nothing to do with lack of sleep. It felt as if all the energy was being leached from my body, drawn inward by some unseen force. I would sit in my room, staring at the wall, too tired to even read the books my father had finally, begrudgingly, returned to me. My mother mistook this for laziness, another symptom of my ongoing rebellion. "Idle hands are the devil's workshop, Lily," she would say, assigning me another pointless chore. I would scrub floors or polish silver, my movements slow and clumsy, my body feeling like it was moving through water. Then came the smells. The world, which had become dull and gray to my senses, suddenly exploded with an unwelcome intensity. The rich, dark scent of my mother's morning coffee, a smell I had always loved, now made my stomach clench. The aroma of bacon frying in a pan sent me fleeing to my room, my hand clamped over my mouth. Everything was too strong, too pungent, too invasive. My body was in revolt, rejecting the very world it inhabited. The sickness arrived on a Tuesday morning. I woke up feeling a strange, uneasy churning in my stomach. I lay perfectly still, hoping it would pass, but it rose like a tide, a wave of nausea so powerful it stole my breath. I threw myself out of bed and stumbled to the bathroom, making it to the toilet just in time. My body convulsed, heaving up nothing but bitter acid, the spasms leaving me weak and trembling, my forehead pressed against the cold, clean porcelain of the bowl. The floor tiles were cool against my cheek. I lay there, listening to the sound of my own ragged breathing, and I knew. It was no longer a fear. It was no longer a possibility I could deny or bargain with. It was a fact, a biological certainty. The sickness was not just a sickness, it was a sign. The silence inside me now had a heartbeat. In that moment, a new kind of terror eclipsed everything that had come before. The fear of Mr. Abernathy was the fear of a monster outside myself. The fear of my parents was the fear of judgment and punishment, but this was different. This was a horror that was part of me, woven into my very cells. It was his crime, living and growing in the most secret, sacred part of my body. My body, the only thing that was truly my own, had been colonized. It was no longer mine. It was a vessel for my shame, a walking, breathing testament to the secret I was forced to keep. I pulled myself up and looked at my reflection in the bathroom mirror. The face that stared back was a stranger's. Her skin was pale and clammy, her eyes wide and dark with a knowledge that no 16-year-old should possess. There was no outward sign yet, no visible change to my flat stomach, but I could feel it. I could feel the alien presence, the tiny, insistent life that was claiming my body as its own. It was a time bomb, ticking away in the dark. The days that followed were a frantic, desperate exercise in concealment. I learned to recognize the morning wave of nausea, waking up before dawn to be sick in secret, running the tap to cover the sound of my retching. I would flush the toilet again and again, terrified of leaving any trace. I developed a strategy for mealtimes, moving food around my plate to create the illusion of eating before scraping it into the trash when no one was looking. I lived in a state of high alert, my every nerve ending frayed. The house, which had been my prison, now became a minefield. Every interaction was a risk, every question from my mother, a potential trap. "You're looking peaked, Lily," she'd say, her eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Are you coming down with something?" "Just tired," I'd mumble, turning away so she couldn't see the panic in my eyes. The secret was no longer a silent, heavy stone in my soul. It had become an active, demanding entity. It had its own needs, its own timetable, and it was growing stronger every day. The burden was becoming unbearable. At night, I would lie in my bed and place a hand on my stomach, on the place where this new life was unfolding. There was no sense of maternal connection, no flutter of love. There was only a profound and sickening sense of violation. It felt like his hand was still on me, a permanent imprint I could never wash away. He, of course, remained oblivious, or at least he performed the part perfectly. I'd see him across the lawn, a picture of serene contentment in his perfect world. His presence was a constant, mocking reminder of the origin of my horror. He was free, celebrated, and respected, while I was trapped here, my body a living prison, counting down the days until my secret would inevitably push itself into the light. The breaking point came about 3 weeks after the sickness began. I had managed to hide it, but the strain was hollowing me out. The secret was too big to carry alone. It was eating me alive from the inside out. I sat on my bed, the door locked, and looked at the book on my shelf, the one that held the wooden bird. The world had shrunk to this single, impossible problem. Time was no longer an endless, abstract thing. It was a finite resource, and mine was running out. A choice had to be made. I could continue this charade for a few more weeks, maybe a month, until my body betrayed me completely. Or I could do the unthinkable. I could confess. I could tear down the wall of silence myself and face the consequences. In the deepest, most terrified part of my heart, a tiny, foolish flicker of hope persisted. It was the desperate hope of a child who still, despite everything, wants to believe in her parents. I thought that if they knew, truly knew, the full extent of the catastrophe, their anger would give way to something else. Pity, maybe, or even protection. Faced with this undeniable physical proof, surely they would have to see me not as a disobedient daughter, but as a victim. Surely they would stand between me and the monster next door. Surely their love for me would be stronger than their fear of shame. It was a fool's hope, but it was the only one I had left. The weight of the secret was crushing me. I couldn't carry it another day. I unlocked my door and walked down the hallway toward the living room, where I could hear the low murmur of my parents' voices. Each step was a step toward a precipice. I was about to set fire to my own life in the desperate hope that they would rush in to save me from the flames. The walk down the hallway felt a mile long. Each floorboard that creaked under my feet seemed to cry out, announcing my doomed procession. Outside, the sky had turned a bruised, greenish gray. The wind was picking up, rattling the window panes in their frames, a prelude to a storm that matched the tempest in my soul. I could hear my parents in the living room, my father turning the pages of the evening paper, the rustle as sharp as dry leaves, and my mother's voice, a low, contented murmur, as she likely recounted some piece of town gossip to him. They were in their world, their orderly, predictable bubble. I was about to burst it with a single, sharp pin. I stopped at the threshold, my hand flat against the doorframe to steady myself. They looked up, their faces etched with annoyance at the interruption. The living room was my mother's sanctuary, a museum of polished wood and carefully arranged respectability. A fire was laid in the hearth, ready for the first chill of autumn but not yet lit. The air was still and heavy. "What is it, Lily?" my father asked, his eyes peering over the top of his reading glasses. He did not lower the paper. My appearance must have been alarming. I was pale, my hair uncombed, my eyes wide and wild with a terror I could no longer contain. My mother put down the sock she was darning, her needle poised in midair. "Good heavens, child, you look like you've seen a ghost," she said. I saw him every time I closed my eyes. The words wouldn't come. My throat was a desert. I opened my mouth, but only a dry, rasping sound came out. I took a staggering step into the room, my legs feeling as though they were made of cotton. I had rehearsed it in my head 100 times, trying to find the right words, a calm and rational way to explain the unexplainable. But there was no rational way. There was only the raw, ugly truth. It came out in a flood, a torrent of choked sobs and fractured words. "It's Mr. Abernathy," I gasped, the name itself feeling like poison on my tongue. "That day, with the bicycle, and then later, in his garage, he... I couldn't say the word. I couldn't give it a name. My hands went to my stomach, a gesture of pure, instinctual confession. He hurt me. He hurt me, and now... I collapsed onto the braided rug before the unlit hearth, my body surrendering to the sobs that shook my entire frame. Through the storm of my own grief, I finally forced out the last damning word. "Pregnant." The word fell into the room and lay there, obscene and monstrous. The rustling of the newspaper stopped. The murmur of my mother's voice was silenced. For a long, terrible moment, the only sounds were my own ragged gasps for air and the rising shriek of the wind outside. It was in that moment of silence that the last vestiges of my childhood died. It was a silence pregnant with possibility, where my parents could have chosen love, could have chosen to rush to my side, to gather me up and promise me that everything would be all right. They did not. My mother was the first to move. She didn't move toward me. She recoiled, pulling back in her chair as if I were something venomous, something contagious that had crawled into her clean, orderly home. Her face, which a moment before had held mild annoyance, twisted into a mask of pure, undiluted disgust. Her horror was not for what had happened to me. It was for the shame I had brought into her house. "What did you do?" she hissed, her voice a low, venomous whisper that cut through me more sharply than any shout. Her eyes raked over me, my crumpled dress, my tear-streaked face. It was an interrogation. I was the guilty party. "What were you wearing? A man like that, a good, respectable man, he doesn't just... You must have encouraged him. You must have led him on." Each question was a physical blow. She was not seeking to understand. She was seeking to blame. She was frantically rearranging the world back into a shape that made sense to her. A world where good men were good, and girls like me were the source of sin. In her eyes, I was not a victim. I was a seductress, a Jezebel. I looked desperately toward my father, my last hope. He had lowered the newspaper and was standing now, his full height casting a long, intimidating shadow over me as a clap of thunder rattled the house. But his face held no pity. His eyes, the same shade of blue as my own, were as cold and hard as river stones. He was not looking at his daughter. He was looking at a problem, a stain that needed to be eradicated. "Be quiet, Mary," he said, his voice a low command. But he wasn't defending me. He was taking control. He looked down at me, huddled on the floor, and his voice was devoid of any warmth, any love, any shred of the paternal affection I had once known. It was the voice of a judge pronouncing a sentence. "You will not ruin this family," he said, the words falling like chips of ice. "You will not bring your lies and your filth into this house and destroy the good name we have built in this community." Your lies. The words echoed in the silent space of my shattered heart. He hadn't even entertained the possibility that I was telling the truth. The very notion was so far outside his carefully constructed reality that he had rejected it instantly. Jacob Abernathy was a good man. Therefore, I had to be a liar. The logic was as simple and as brutal as an execution. "It's not a lie," I sobbed, the words useless against the wall of their certainty. "It's the truth. Please, Daddy, please believe me." "Silence," he commanded, and the word was a slap. "Go to your room. We will deal with this. We will decide what is to be done." They didn't touch me. They didn't help me up. They left me there, a heap of misery on the floor of their perfect living room, and turned away from me, already beginning to murmur to each other in low, urgent tones, their words lost in the sound of the rain that now lashed against the windows. They were not discussing how to help me. They were not discussing how to bring a monster to justice. They were discussing how to manage a crisis, how to contain a scandal. I finally managed to pull myself to my feet, my body aching with a grief so profound it felt physical. I stumbled back down the hallway, the familiar path now feeling alien and hostile. I'd walked into that room as their daughter, clinging to a desperate, childish hope that I was loved unconditionally. I walked out as an object of their shame, a liability to be managed. I closed my bedroom door and slid down against it, the sobs coming now without sound, my body too exhausted for noise. The pain of the assault in the garage was a white-hot, searing agony, but this was a cold, spreading poison. This was the true violation, to be disbelieved, to be condemned by the very people who gave you life. Mr. Abernathy had broken my body and my spirit, but my parents, in that moment, had broken my heart, and they had proved the monster right. I was utterly, completely alone. I was sent to my room, but it was not a sanctuary. It was a holding cell. The storm outside had exhausted its fury, leaving behind a world washed clean and unnervingly silent. The only sounds were the drip of water from the eaves and the low, urgent murmur of my parents' voices from the living room below. I couldn't make out the words, only the rhythm of their conversation. My mother's sharp, panicked tones and my father's low, rumbling responses. They were not planning a rescue. They were plotting a damage assessment. They were not my allies. They were the arbiters of my fate. I sat on the edge of my bed, my body rigid, my hands clasped so tightly my knuckles were white. Hours seemed to crawl by. The last of the gray daylight faded from the sky, and the streetlights on Elm Avenue flickered on, casting long, lonely shadows into my room. Then, the murmuring downstairs stopped. I heard the scrape of chairs, the heavy tread of my father's footsteps. I crept to my door, pressing my ear against the cool wood. I heard the front door open and close. Peeking through my window, I saw them, my mother and father walking side by side down our front path. They were not marching with the righteous fury of wronged parents on their way to confront a villain. Their steps were hesitant, their shoulders slumped. My mother had her arms wrapped around herself as if warding off a chill, though the night was mild. My father walked with his head down, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. They walked the 20 yards to Mr. Abernathy's front door, a journey that felt as momentous and terrible as a pilgrimage to a dark god. A sliver of insane, irrational hope lodged itself in my throat. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe their coldness toward me was just shock. Maybe now, after hours of deliberation, they were going to do the right thing. They were going to demand justice. They were going to save me. The porch light of the house next door clicked on, illuminating them in a stark yellow glare. Mr. Abernathy himself opened the door. From my vantage point, I couldn't hear a word, but I could read the grim pantomime. There was no shouting, no accusation. He gestured for them to come inside, his movements calm and welcoming, as if he had been expecting them. The door closed, and the light in his downstairs study, a room I had never seen, but which I imagined to be filled with dark wood and the smell of leather and power, switched on. His window became my silent movie screen, the stage for the next act of my destruction. I knelt on the floor, my chin resting on the windowsill, and watched the silhouettes move behind the curtains. I saw my parents sit stiffly in chairs that seemed too large for them. I saw Mr. Abernathy move with a fluid, easy grace, taking a seat behind his large desk. He was in his element. He was in control. My parents looked like timid supplicants in the court of a king. I couldn't know then the exact words that were spoken in that room, but I would piece it together later, from the fragments of their arguments, from the hollow look in their eyes, from the terrible proposal they would bring back to me. Years of reflection have filled in the gaps, painting a picture more vivid and horrifying than anything I could have imagined that night. My father, I picture, began with a weak, blustering attempt at accusation, his voice lacking the conviction of his earlier pronouncements to me. Our daughter. She's making certain claims, Abernathy. Terrible claims. And Jacob, leaning back in his leather chair, would have let him finish, a look of profound, sorrowful understanding on his face. He would not have become defensive. That was not his way. He would have gone on the offensive by feigning compassion. David, Mary, please, he would have said, his voice laced with a carefully measured sadness. I am so sorry you are going through this. I understand your predicament. Lily is a troubled girl. She has a rich fantasy life. It's something I've worried about for some time. He would have positioned himself as their ally, a fellow adult concerned for a wayward child. But my father, for all his faults, was not a complete fool. He would have pressed, the accusation of pregnancy a stark fact that couldn't be easily dismissed as fantasy. She's in trouble, Jacob, real trouble. And that is when the trap, so patiently laid for years, would have been sprung. That is when Jacob Abernathy would have ceased to be the kindly neighbor and revealed himself as the master of my father's fate. He would have reached into a drawer of his great, dark desk and removed a ledger. Not a weapon, not a threat, just a simple book of accounts. He would have opened it and turned it around for my father to see. Yes, Abernathy would have said, his voice dropping, losing its sympathetic edge and taking on the cold, hard tone of business. Trouble is something I understand. And I have always been a helpful man. His finger would have traced a line of figures in the ledger. David, your business loan, the one that saved you from bankruptcy a few years back. You thought the bank arranged it, a stroke of luck, but luck has very little to do with it. I happen to own the debt now. I have for some time. The heir would have left the room. My father's world, built on the illusion of his own hard-won success and respectability, would have begun to crumble. That loan had been his secret shame and his salvation, the thing that allowed him to continue playing the part of the solid, responsible provider. He had been living on borrowed time, and he had never even known who the lender was. And, of course, Abernathy would have continued, twisting the knife. There are the other indiscretions I've helped you navigate over the years. His eyes would have met my father's, and a silent, terrible understanding would have passed between them. It wasn't just debt. It was the cover-up of a small fraud at the mill, a matter of fudged invoices and phantom inventory that Abernathy had quietly made disappear. It was a secret that would mean not just financial ruin, but a jail cell and the complete and utter destruction of the name David Clark had worked his whole life to build. From my window, I saw the change. I saw my father's silhouette, which had been leaning forward aggressively, shrink back into his chair. I saw my mother's hand fly to her mouth. The fight drained out of them, siphoned away by a terror far greater than their concern for me. They had walked into that room as the parents of a violated daughter. They were now nothing more than two people caught in a snare, their own ruin staring them in the face. Their honor, their standing in the community, their very freedom, it was all in the hands of the man they had come to accuse. The conversation inside would have shifted then. It would no longer have been about me or what happened to me. It would have been about them, about a solution, about a way out. And Jacob Abernathy, the benevolent predator, would have offered one. After an eternity, the front door of the house next door opened again. My parents emerged, blinking in the porch light like creatures emerging from a long, dark cave. They looked smaller, defeated. They walked back across the lawn, their steps heavy, their faces grim masks of despair. They didn't look at each other. They didn't look at my window. They looked at the ground, as if the weight of their bargain was too heavy to allow them to lift their heads. As they stepped back into our house, the last foolish ember of hope inside me died and turned to ash. They hadn't gone there to save me. They had gone there to save themselves. I now understood that our family was a house of cards, built on a foundation of my father's secret shame. And Jacob Abernathy had owned that foundation all along. My body, my future, my life. It was all just currency in a negotiation I had no part in. It was the price they were now considering paying to keep their own world from being torn apart. I did not sleep. Sleep was a luxury for a world that still made sense, for people who were not awaiting a sentence. I sat on the floor of my room, my back against the bed, and listened to the house settle around me. The storm had passed, and in its wake, an unnatural quiet descended, broken only by the drip of water from the gutters and the frantic, silent beating of my own heart. I heard my parents come in. I heard the soft click of the front door, a sound of finality. There was no shouting, no crying. There was only a heavy, weary silence, followed by the clink of glasses and the low, strained murmur of their voices from the kitchen. They were fortifying themselves, gathering their strength for what they had to do next. An hour passed, maybe more. Time had become a thick, viscous thing that I had to wade through. Then, I heard their footsteps on the stairs. Not one set, but two. They were synchronized, heavy and deliberate. They were not the footsteps of parents coming to comfort a grieving child. They were the footsteps of wardens approaching a cell. My door opened without a knock. The small courtesy of a rap on the wood was a right I no longer possessed. They stood in the doorway together, a united front, their bodies blocking the dim light from the hallway. My mother's face was pale and drawn, her eyes red-rimmed but dry, fixed on a point just above my head. My father's expression was grim, his jaw set, his face a mask of cold, hard resolve. They looked like strangers performing a painful but necessary duty. "Lily," my father began, and his voice was flat, devoid of all emotion. "Your mother and I have spoken with Mr. Abernathy." I flinched at the name. It felt like a physical blow. I said nothing, just stared up at them from the floor, a knot of ice forming in the pit of my stomach. It was my mother who spoke next, her voice thin and brittle, as if the words were sharp-edged things she had to force from her throat. She had found a way to wrap this horror in the language of piety, to make it sound not like a damnation, but a salvation. "Mr. Abernathy," she said, her gaze still refusing to meet mine, "has offered a solution. He is a remarkably forgiving and generous man. He is willing to offer a way to cleanse this stain." Stain. The word hung in the air between us. I was the stain. My shame, my violation, the life growing inside me. It was a blemish on the clean fabric of their lives, and they had found a way to scrub it out. "He is willing to do the honorable thing," she finished, the word honorable a grotesque mockery. I still didn't understand. My mind, numb with dread, couldn't make sense of her words. A solution? What solution could there be? My gaze shifted to my father, searching his stony face for some clue, some hint of the sentence to come. He gave it to me, without preamble, without softness, without mercy. "You will marry him," he said. The 4 words did not register at first. They were a random collection of sounds, a sentence in a language I didn't speak. Marry him. Marry him. The concept was so monstrous, so utterly outside the realm of human possibility, that my mind simply refused to process it. It was like being told the sky was green, or that fire was cold. It was a fundamental violation of the laws of nature. I must have made some sound, a small, strangled gasp, because my father's eyes narrowed. "It is the only way," he said, his voice hard, cutting off any protest before it could form. "The child will have his name. It will be born into a respectable family, under the roof of its father. There will be no scandal. This family will not be destroyed." The logic of it finally crashed through the wall of my disbelief, and the horror that followed was a physical thing. It was a wave of ice water that rushed up from my feet, stealing the air from my lungs, making the room tilt and spin. The blood roared in my ears. I felt myself sway, and I put a hand out to the floor to steady myself. Marry him. They were not just abandoning me to the monster. They were going to lock me in the cage with him forever. They were going to chain me to my rapist and call it a marriage. No, I whispered, the word a tiny, hopeless puff of air. No, you can't, please. I looked at my mother, appealing to the woman who had tucked me in at night, who had kissed my scraped knees, who had once, a lifetime ago, loved me. Mama, please, you can't do this to me. Please don't make me. For the first time, she looked at me. Her eyes were not the eyes of a mother. They were the eyes of a zealot, filled with a terrible, self-righteous certainty. She had convinced herself that this act of supreme cruelty was a righteous one. It is God's will that this sin be covered by the grace of matrimony, she said, her voice trembling with a perverse piety. You have made your bed, Lily. Mr. Abernathy is giving you the chance to lie in it with honor. You should be grateful. Grateful. The word shattered the last piece of my heart. I was to be grateful for my life sentence. Grateful for being delivered, bound and gagged, into the hands of the man who had destroyed me. I looked from her face to my father's. There was no escape. I saw it in the hard set of his jaw, in the cold finality of my mother's gaze. They had made their bargain. They had weighed my life, my soul, against their reputation and their security, and they had found me wanting. I was the price. I was the sacrifice they were willing to make on the altar of their own fear and pride. They had said all they came to say. My father gave a curt final nod, as if concluding a business transaction. They turned and walked out of my room, pulling the door closed behind them. The soft click of the latch was the loudest sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of my tomb being sealed. I was left alone in the sudden, ringing silence. My bedroom, with its floral wallpaper and the innocent relics of my childhood, was no longer my own. It was a prison cell. The four walls seemed to be closing in on me, suffocating me. I crawled to my bed and curled into a tight ball, wrapping my arms around myself, but there was no comfort. I was a prisoner, and my parents, my own mother and father, were my jailers. The days that followed the unholy proposal bled into one another, a monotonous gray smear of waking, waiting, and fearing. My life became a tightly controlled routine, orchestrated by my parents to ensure my compliance. The door to my bedroom was now locked from the outside at night. During the day, my mother was my constant shadow, her presence a silent, suffocating weight. I was never left alone. They were afraid I would run, or worse, that I would find a way to end the life inside me, and in doing so, ruin their desperate, monstrous plan. The wedding preparations began with a surreal and ghoulish diligence. My mother would sit at the kitchen table with a notepad, her lips pursed in concentration. I think simple white roses would be best for the centerpiece, she said to no one in particular, her voice jarringly normal. Tasteful. Understated. She was planning the decor for my lifelong incarceration as if it were any other small-town wedding. Each mention of flowers or guest lists was another shovelful of dirt on the grave they were digging for me. My father spoke to me only to issue commands. Sit up straight, Lily. Eat your dinner. We will be attending church on Sunday. You will smile. His words were like iron nails, pinning me into the role they had assigned me, the repentant, grateful bride. In the face of their united, unyielding front, the fight had drained out of me, leaving behind a hollow, desolate landscape of despair. I was going to be married to Jacob Abernathy. I was going to live in that pristine white house next door, a house that was a monument to my violation. I would bear his child. This was my reality now. Accepting it felt like swallowing glass. My only escape was in the books I was still, mercifully, allowed to read. They were my only window out of the suffocating confines of my room. I devoured them, not for the stories they told, but for the simple fact that they were a world away from mine. And it was there, lost in the pages of some forgotten novel, that a tiny, desperate idea began to form. It was a flicker of a thought so faint I almost dismissed it. The library. The library was a public space, a neutral ground. And it was the domain of Mrs. Eleanor Vance. I remembered her from my visits before my world had collapsed. She was a quiet woman, with kind, intelligent eyes behind horn-rimmed glasses. She was not like the other women in town, the ones who traded gossip over picket fences and whose conversations revolved around piety and appearances. Mrs. Vance moved with a quiet authority, her world one of facts and stories, of knowledge and order. She had never judged my choice of books, had never offered unsolicited advice. She had simply stamped them, smiled a small, genuine smile, and wished me happy reading. She was an adult who seemed to exist outside the town's suffocating social ecosystem. She was a long shot. She was my only shot. The opportunity came, as I knew it must, disguised as an errand of propriety. My mother, in her quest to maintain the facade of a normal, well-run household, noticed the stack of overdue library books on my nightstand. "We will not have overdue books, Lily," she announced one morning, her voice tight with disapproval. "We are not that kind of family. Get yourself dressed. We are going to the library." We, not you. I was to be escorted, a prisoner on a supervised outing. But it was the chance I needed. My heart, which had been a dull, leaden thing in my chest, began to beat with a frantic, terrified rhythm. That morning, while my mother was busy in the kitchen, I committed my act of rebellion. My hands trembled so violently I could barely hold the pencil. On a small scrap of paper torn from the back of a notebook, I wrote 2 words, the only 2 that mattered. Then I added a third, a plea that was the sum of all my fear. "He watches me. Help." I folded the note into a tiny, tight square and slipped it deep within the pages of the thickest book, the one whose spine was most likely to conceal it. The walk to the library was tense and silent. My mother held my arm in a grip that was just a little too tight, her fingers like talons on my elbow. The town looked the same, the neat houses, the smiling faces, but I saw it all through a new lens. It was a stage set, and everyone was playing a part, oblivious to the real, ugly drama unfolding just beneath the surface. The moment we pushed through the heavy oak doors of the library, I felt a sense of relief so profound it almost made me dizzy. The air inside was cool and still, smelling of old paper, binding glue, and floor polish. It was a smell of sanity, of order. The hushed silence was a balm after the charged, violent silence of my home. Mrs. Vance was at the main desk, stamping a return card with a satisfying, rhythmic thump-thump. She looked up as we approached, and a small, polite smile touched her lips. Then her eyes met mine, and the smile faltered. I knew she saw it. She saw the hollowed-out look in my eyes, the gauntness of my face, the tremor in my hands. Her gaze sharpened with a flicker of concern that was so different from my mother's critical stare that it nearly brought tears to my eyes. "Lily, how nice to see you," she said, her voice soft. "We're just returning these," my mother said briskly, placing the stack of books on the counter and pointedly ignoring Mrs. Vance's compassionate gaze at me. My heart was hammering against my ribs. This was the moment. My mother was watching me, her eyes narrowed. I had to make it look like an accident. I reached for the top book, the one with the note, and as I lifted it, I let it slip from my grasp. It fell to the floor with a loud, startling thwack, sprawling open. "Clumsy," my mother hissed under her breath. I bent down to retrieve it, my movement stiff with terror. My hand was shaking as I picked it up. I didn't dare look to see if the note was visible. I simply closed the book and placed it on the counter, my eyes fixed on the worn linoleum floor. I could not look at Mrs. Vance. I could not risk my expression betraying me. I just had to trust that the message had been delivered. "Thank you," I mumbled, and turned to follow my mother, who was already heading for the door, her duty done. As we left, I risked a single, fleeting glance over my shoulder. Mrs. Vance was not looking at us. She was looking down at the book I had dropped. Her hand rested on its cover, her fingers tracing the title. Then slowly, she picked it up. For the rest of the day, I was locked in an agony of suspense. Had she found it? Did she think it was a prank? Would she ignore it? Or worse, would she go to my parents, who would then punish me for this desperate, foolish act of rebellion? I didn't know it then, but my whisper had been heard. After we left, Eleanor Vance, A woman who trusted the evidence of her own eyes over the town's polished gossip took the book to her back office. She opened it, and the small folded square of paper fell out onto her desk. She unfolded it and read the 3 words. Her calm librarian's face hardened. The fear she had seen in my eyes now had a voice, however faint. It was not a prank. It was a plea from a cage. She sat there for a long time, the note held in her hand, the quiet hum of her library, a stark contrast to the sudden, noisy call to action in her heart. She didn't know what she was going to do yet, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She was not going to ignore it. I had thrown my message in a bottle into the vast, indifferent ocean of the world, and against all odds, someone had just picked it up. The 2 days that followed my desperate plea at the library were the purest form of torture. I existed in a state of suspended animation, every fiber of my being attuned to the possibility of rescue. Hope is a terrible, addictive substance. Having been without it for so long, the tiny dose I had given myself was now sending my system into overdrive. Every time the phone rang, I would freeze, my breath catching in my throat. Every car that slowed on our street sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. I was waiting for a savior, for a knock on the door that would signal the end of my nightmare. The knock came on a Thursday afternoon. I was in my room, listlessly staring out the window, when an unfamiliar, mud-splattered sedan pulled up to the curb in front of our house. A woman in a practical brown suit got out, carrying a briefcase. She looked tired and purposeful. My heart didn't leap. It felt as though it had stopped beating entirely. She came. Mrs. Vance did it. She sent someone. For one glorious, blinding moment, I felt a surge of vindication so powerful it made me dizzy. I was not crazy. I was not alone. Someone had heard me. I watched as the woman walked up our path, but before she could ring the bell, the front door opened. My father stood there, his face a perfect mask of weary concern. He had obviously been watching for her. He greeted her not with suspicion, but with a handshake and a somber, welcoming nod. He ushered her inside, and a moment later, I saw Mr. Abernathy cross the lawn and enter our house through the back door, as if on a prearranged signal. The trap was set. My rescue mission was being ambushed before it had even begun. I was left to wait in my room, the silence from downstairs a thick, oppressive blanket. I could only imagine the scene. They would be in the living room, my mother offering the woman coffee, her hands steady, her voice dripping with the false sincerity of a grieving but resilient parent. They would be painting their picture for her, their masterpiece of deception, before I was even allowed to speak. After what felt like an eternity, my mother's voice called up the stairs, devoid of any warmth. "Lily? Come down here. There is a Ms. Albright here to see you." Walking into the living room felt like walking into my own trial. Ms. Albright, the social worker, sat in the armchair usually reserved for important guests like the pastor. My parents sat together on the sofa, a portrait of concerned unity. And Jacob Abernathy sat in the wing-back chair by the unlit hearth, his legs crossed, his expression one of deep, benevolent sadness. He looked like a family friend, a trusted counselor who had come to offer his support in a time of crisis. The 4 of them looked up as I entered. I was not a child seeking help. I was a specimen being brought out for examination. "Lily, thank you for joining us, Miss Albright said, her voice professional but tired. "Your parents and Mr. Abernathy have been telling me about some of the difficulties you've been having lately." My father sighed, a heavy theatrical sound. "We're at our wits' end, Ms. Albright. We love our daughter, but she's become unreachable. The lies, the moods. We have her school reports, if you'd like to see." He gestured to a folder on the coffee table, filled with the evidence of my sin. "And this obsession she's developed," my mother added, her voice trembling with practiced emotion. "It's not healthy to make up such terrible, hurtful stories about a man who has been nothing but a kind friend to this family. It's a cry for attention, we know, but it's gone too far." Then Abernathy spoke, his voice the epitome of calm, rational sorrow. "I've known the Clarks for years," he said, looking at Mr. Albright with his honest sky-blue eyes. "And I've tried to be a friend to young Lily, I think, perhaps, she may have misinterpreted some neighborly kindness. It's heartbreaking to see her in such distress." He turned his gaze on me, and it was filled not with malice, but with a deep, crushing pity. It was a look that said, "You poor sick child, let us help you." It was the cruelest, most effective weapon in his arsenal. Finally, Ms. Albright turned to me. "Lily, is there anything you want to say?" The three of them stared at me, their collective weight pressing down on me. I opened my mouth, and the truth I had so desperately wanted to tell came out as a weak, trembling whisper. "He's lying. They're all lying. He hurt me. He's the reason I'm sick." As I spoke, my mother let out a small, wounded gasp and put a hand to her chest. My father shook his head slowly, a look of profound parental disappointment on his face. Abernathy just looked at me with those same sad, pitying eyes. My words, my truth, sounded wild and hysterical in the face of their united, calm, and reasonable front. I was one trembling, incoherent girl against three respectable, concerned adults. It was not a fair fight. It was never going to be a fair fight. Miss Albright listened, her expression unreadable. She asked a few more questions, her tone becoming increasingly clinical. When she was done, she closed her notebook and stood up. She delivered her verdict, not to me, but to my parents. "It seems clear that the family is under a great deal of strain," she said, her professional gaze sweeping over us. "Lily is exhibiting classic signs of adolescent turmoil, possibly complicated by some deep-seated emotional issues. I would recommend family counseling to open up the lines of communication." She turned to my parents. "And I commend you for providing such a structured, supportive environment. Firm boundaries are exactly what she needs right now." She was siding with them. She was validating their story. She was praising my jailers for the quality of their prison. She gave me a brief, dismissive nod. "It will get better, Lily. Try to listen to your parents." And then she was gone. My father saw her to the door. Mr. Abernathy stood up, placed a comforting hand on my father's shoulder as he returned, and then let himself out the back door, his work done. The three of us were left in the living room. The concerned masks my parents had been wearing dissolved, replaced by a cold, simmering fury. "Are you satisfied?" my father asked, his voice low and dangerous. "You tried to bring shame on this family from the outside. You tried to ruin us with your stories, and you failed. No one believes you, Lily. No one ever will." He was right. I had played my only card, and it had been useless. My attempt to find a savior had not only failed, it had backfired spectacularly. I had proven to my parents that I could not be trusted, that I was a liability who needed to be controlled more tightly than ever. I had given them the ultimate justification for their plan. I looked at their hard faces and realized the devastating truth. The world was not designed to save girls like me from men like him. There was no cavalry coming over the hill. There was no justice waiting in the wings. The system, the very concept of safety I had been taught to believe in, was a lie. The truth wasn't a weapon. It was just a story. And when you are a child and the adults around you decide your story is a lie, you are not just voiceless. You are nothing. My last hope died in that living room, and in its place, something cold and hard and silent began to grow. The failure of Ms. Albright's visit was the final nail in the coffin of the girl I used to be. The world had rendered its verdict. I was a liar. My truth had no currency. My hope for rescue was a foolish, childish fantasy. In the days that followed, a profound and terrifying numbness settled over me. It was a state beyond despair, a quiet, hollow emptiness where even tears could not form. The fight had gone out of me, leaving nothing but a husk. My parents sensed this shift and mistook it for submission. They relaxed their guard slightly, believing they had finally broken my rebellious spirit. The wedding date was set for a week's time. It was to be a small, private affair in our own living room, with only the minister and a few necessary witnesses. It was a ceremony designed not for celebration, but for containment. The evening before the wedding, they summoned me to the living room for the final time. It was a formal tribunal. My father stood by the fireplace. My mother sat rigidly on the sofa, and Jacob Abernathy, my buyer, my owner, stood by the window, looking out into the twilight as if he were a pensive poet rather than a predator inspecting his catch. They had brought me here to extract the last piece of my soul they required, my verbal consent. They needed to hear me say yes. They needed it for their own conscience, for the flimsy narrative they had constructed where this was a choice, not a sentence. They began their final assault on my will, each of them using their preferred weapon. My mother went first, her voice laced with the twisted logic of her self-deception. "Lily, this is the only way forward," she pleaded, her hands twisting a handkerchief in her lap. "Think of the child. It deserves a name, a father. This is your chance to redeem this situation in the eyes of God, to cover this mistake with the sanctity of marriage." My father's approach was, as always, a hammer. "There will be no more discussion," he stated, his voice a low growl. "Your defiance is at an end. You will accept the generous offer Mr. Abernathy has made, and you will do it with a grateful heart. You will not bring further disgrace upon this family. You will do your duty." Then, it was Jacob's turn. He was the most insidious of all. He crossed the room and knelt before me where I sat in a hard-backed chair, a prisoner in the dock. He took my limp, cold hands in his own. His were warm and dry. He looked into my face, his expression a perfect performance of gentle, loving concern. "Lily flower," he murmured, his voice a soft, persuasive caress. "Don't fight this anymore, my dear. Let me take care of you. I will give you everything. A beautiful home, a good life for you and for our child." He squeezed my hands. "We can be a family, a real family. All you have to do is say yes. Just one word, and we can begin our life together." They bombarded me with their words, their reasons, their demands. They circled me like wolves waiting for the final collapse. I remained silent, my eyes vacant, fixed on the floral pattern of the rug. I let their words wash over me, a meaningless tide of noise. But inside my silent, hollowed-out soul, something extraordinary was happening. The numbness was not emptiness. It was a clearing. The despair that had choked me for months was burning away like a fever, leaving behind not health but a strange, cold clarity. The endless ocean of tears I had cried had finally run dry. And in that arid, desolate landscape, I could finally see them. I looked at my mother's face and saw not a righteous woman, but a terrified coward, so desperate to hide from shame that she would sacrifice her own daughter. I looked at my father's stony expression and saw not a strong patriarch, but a weak, pathetic man, a slave to secrets and debts, willing to sell his own child to save his pathetic pride. And I looked at Jacob Abernathy kneeling before me, his face a mask of love, and I saw the monster in its purest form, a creature whose greatest weapon was its disguise. And I felt nothing, no fear, no sadness, only a vast, bottomless contempt. They could not break what was already broken. They could not kill what was already dead. The girl who had cried for help, the girl who had hoped for rescue, the girl who had loved them, she was gone. They had murdered her, right here in this room. And in her place, something else was being born. They want me to surrender, I thought, a clear, cold voice cutting through the fog in my mind. But surrender is an end. This is a beginning. A vow began to form inside me, forged not in hope or strength, but in the absolute certainty of my own ruin. It was a vow of ice. You want my consent. You will have it. You want a bride? I will be the perfect bride. I will wear the white dress. I will smile for the minister. I will say the vows. I will be your wife, Jacob. I will be a model of obedience and gratitude. I will let you believe you have won. I will let you all believe you have broken me, and I will wait. I will watch. I will learn every one of your weaknesses, every one of your secrets, every one of your fears. I will be the poison in your cup, the flaw in your design, the patient, quiet architect of your undoing. I will not be your victim. I will be the tombstone you carry to your grave. The war could not be won with tears or screams or pleas for justice. The world had already told me so. No, this war had to be fought in secret. It had to be a war of silence, of patience, of observation, To win, I had to first pretend to lose completely. A long, tense silence had fallen over the room. They were watching me, waiting for my final collapse. I slowly lifted my head. I let my gaze travel from my mother's face to my father's, and finally, to Jacob's. The vacant fear in my eyes was gone, replaced by a profound emptiness that they mistook for submission. They saw a defeated girl. They had no idea they were looking at a weapon. I focused on Jacob Abernathy. My voice, when it came, was flat, dead, and utterly devoid of emotion. "Yes," I said. "I accept." A collective sigh of relief went through the room. My mother's tense shoulders slumped. My father gave a curt, satisfied nod. Jacob's face broke into a triumphant, loving smile. He thought he had finally won. He leaned in to kiss me, but I turned my head slightly, and his lips brushed my cold cheek. He pulled back, a flicker of confusion in his eyes, but he dismissed it. They had their victory. They had my word. They had no idea that my yes was not an act of surrender. It was a declaration of war. The day of my wedding dawned gray and breathless. A thick, oppressive fog clung to the ground in Harmony Creek, muffling all sound, making the world outside my window seem remote and unreal. It was a fitting atmosphere for the day of my execution. My mother dressed me in a simple white dress she had bought in the city. It was made of cotton, with a high collar and long sleeves, a garment designed to signify a purity I no longer possessed. It felt like a shroud. She did not speak as she fastened the tiny pearl buttons up my back, her fingers cold and businesslike. Her silence was a testament to her resolve. She was seeing this through, no matter the cost, to my soul. I looked at my reflection in the mirror. A pale, hollow-eyed stranger stared back, her face a blank mask. I had practiced this expression. It was the look of a broken girl, a submissive bride. It was my camouflage. Inside, the vow of ice held firm, a solid, cold core around which my tattered emotions swirled. I was terrified, but for the first time my terror had a purpose. It was the terror of a soldier before a battle. She knows she may not survive, but which she must fight nonetheless. Downstairs, the living room had been transformed into a makeshift chapel of doom. A few chairs were arranged in neat rows. Reverend Michael, the young, nervous minister from our church, stood shifting his weight from foot to foot, his Bible clutched in his sweaty hands. My father stood beside him, his face grim, his best suit looking stiff and unnatural on him. And then there was Jacob. He was immaculate in a dark gray suit, a single white rosebud in his lapel. He beamed at me as my father led me into the room, his eyes full of possessive, triumphant pride. He saw his prize, his property, delivered as promised. He reached for my hand, and I placed my cold, limp fingers in his, my touch unresponsive. He squeezed my hand, his smile never faltering. We stood before the minister. The sparse audience consisted only of my parents. The ceremony began, Reverend Michael's voice a low, monotonous drone. He spoke of love, of fidelity, of the sanctity of the union we were about to enter. The words were a vile, blasphemous parody. Every mention of love was a stab wound. Every promise of devotion was a lie. I stood perfectly still, my eyes fixed on a point on the wall behind the minister's head, my mind a fortress of cold resolve. "And do you, Jacob Abernathy, take this woman?" He was just about to ask for the vows, the words that would legally bind me to my monster forever, when the sound came. A sharp, insistent ringing that shattered the funereal quiet of the room. The doorbell. Everyone froze. A look of profound annoyance crossed my father's face. Who would dare interrupt this grim, private transaction? He strode to the door and pulled it open, ready to dismiss whoever was there. Standing on the porch was a woman I did not recognize. She was in her late 30s, with sharp, intelligent features weathered by a hard life. Her hair was cut short, and her eyes, a shade of blue startlingly similar to Jacob's, burned with a cold, determined fire. She was not here to pay a social call. "Sarah," my father breathed, his voice a mixture of shock and confusion. "Hello, David," the woman said, her voice steady and clear. She pushed past him, her gaze sweeping the room and landing, like a physical blow, on her brother. Jacob's confident smile vanished as if it had been wiped from his face. His skin turned a pale, pasty gray. "Sarah," he stammered. "What are you doing here?" "I heard you were getting married again, brother," she said, her voice dripping with irony as she walked to the center of the room. "I thought I should be here, to make sure the bride knows about your hobbies." "Now see here," my father started, stepping forward. "This is a private—" Sarah cut him off with a look so sharp it silenced him. "I'm not talking to you." Her attention was fixed entirely on Jacob, who looked like a cornered animal. "He has a collection, doesn't he?" she said, her voice ringing out in the silent room. "Little carved things, trophies. He gave one to me too when I was 14, right after he—" She let the sentence hang in the air, unfinished but understood. "But I imagine he still has his prize, the one he values most, a silver locket. With a lock of hair inside, our cousin Mary's hair, the one who drowned in the lake all those years ago." A strangled gasp escaped my mother's lips. The accusation was monstrous, unthinkable. It hung in the air, a charge of not just assault, but murder. Jacob's face was slick with sweat. "You're insane," he hissed. "You've been telling these lies for years. No one believed you then, and no one will believe you now." "Maybe," Sarah said softly. "But I'm not the only one he told his stories to." She turned then, and for the first time, she looked at me. Her eyes were not filled with pity, but with a fierce, terrible, shared understanding. It was a look that crossed a generation of pain, a look of recognition between two of his victims. "He told you the story, didn't he?" she asked me directly, her voice gentle now. "About the star that fell from the sky, a piece of which he keeps, his own private meteorite?" The room tilted. It was a bizarre, intimate detail, a piece of twisted fantasy he had whispered to me in the dark of his garage to make the violation seem like something magical, something special. It was a detail so specific, so insane, that no one could have ever guessed it. It was the secret handshake of his survivors. All eyes turned to me. Jacob's were wide with panic. My parents were filled with confusion. This was it. This was the moment my vow of ice had prepared me for. My silence was at an end. I lifted my head and looked directly at Jacob Abernathy. My voice, when I spoke, did not tremble. It was as cold and clear and sharp as a shard of glass. "It's not a rock," I said. The blood drained completely from his face. "It's in his study," I continued, my voice gaining strength with every word, every truth I had been forced to bury. "In a locked, carved wooden box. He keeps it hidden behind the large painting of the sea that hangs over his desk." I held his terrified gaze. "It's a silver locket. He showed it to me." I paused, letting the weight of my knowledge settle over the room, letting my parents understand that I could only know this if I had been there, in his private space, in his confidence. Then I delivered the final, killing blow. He said it was his first trophy. The confession, specific and undeniable, detonated in the center of the room. My mother let out a high, thin scream, a sound of a world breaking. My father stared at Jacob, his face a mask of dawning, horrified comprehension, the entire web of lies, debt, and deceit unraveling before his very eyes. The minister backed away, his face ashen, and Jacob Abernathy, the pillar of the community, the respected man of God, the benevolent groom, finally, completely, broke. The mask shattered, and for the first time, everyone in the room saw the monster cowering beneath. The silence that followed my final words was more profound than any sound. It was a vacuum, sucking the air and the life from the room. Then, it shattered into chaos. My mother's scream was the first crack in the dam. It was a high, animalistic sound of a mind breaking, of a carefully constructed reality imploding. Jacob, his face a grotesque mask of terror, lunged not for me, but for the door. His instinct was to flee, to escape the room where his true self had been laid bare. But my father, finally shaken from the stupor of his own cowardice, moved to block his path. The two men stood facing each other, not as respected neighbors, but as a ruined man and the monster who had ruined him. "You." my father choked out, his voice thick with a rage that had come far too late. "In my house!" It was Sarah who took control. Her voice cut through the rising hysteria with the sharp authority of someone long accustomed to her brother's evil. "Don't let him leave, David. Reverend, call the police." Now. The young minister, who looked as though he might faint, fumbled for the telephone with a trembling hand, his eyes wide with horror. Jacob, seeing his escape cut off, turned on me, his face contorted with a vicious, cornered animal snarl. "You lying little witch! You'll pay for this!" But the threat was hollow now. The power was gone. He was no longer the puppet master, just a man in a suit whose strings had been cut. I looked at him, at the pathetic, sweating creature he had become, and I felt nothing but a vast, cold emptiness. My vow was complete. He was undone. The arrival of the police cruiser, its single red light flashing silently against the fog-dampened houses of Elm Avenue, was the official end of the life we had all known. The private horror of our living room became a public spectacle. Neighbors' curtains twitched. Lights flicked on in houses down the street. The secret was out, crawling from the dark corners of our two houses and into the open. The investigation was swift and methodical. Guided by my testimony and Sarah's, the police searched Jacob's study. They found the locked wooden box behind the painting of the sea. They found the silver locket inside. And in a hidden compartment in his closet, they found them. A small flock of beautifully carved wooden birds, each one a silent testament to an unknown victim, an unknown story of violation. One of them, I knew, was mine. It was a chilling, tangible library of his crimes. News in a town like Harmony Creek moves like a contagion. The story of Jacob Abernathy's arrest spread first as a wildfire of gossip and disbelief, then settled into a thick, suffocating smoke of accepted truth. People who had praised him at church potlucks now recalled with sudden clarity a look in his eye they didn't like, a comment that had made them uneasy. His myth, so carefully constructed over decades, was dismantled in a matter of days. The perfect neighbor became the monster next door, a boogeyman to frighten children with, his name a curse on the lips of the people who had once revered him. But the town's judgment did not stop at his front door. It seeped across the lawn and poisoned the ground beneath my own family's feet. The full story, in all its sordid detail, inevitably came to light. The story of my father's debt, of the hushed-up fraud, of the devil's bargain they had made to marry me off to my abuser. The town, in its collective righteous horror, turned on my parents with a ferocity they had once reserved for judging sinners and outsiders. They weren't charged with a crime, but their punishment was, in its own way, just as absolute. They were branded. They became social lepers. People would cross the street to avoid them. Whispers followed them in the aisles of the grocery store. The respectability they had worshipped, the good name they had been willing to sell my soul for, was annihilated. Their prison was not one of bars, but of averted eyes and silent condemnation in the very community they had tried so hard to impress. I saw them once, a few weeks later, from the window of Sarah's car. They were walking out of the post office, huddled together, looking old and gray and broken. They were pariahs in their own personal Eden. I felt no pity, only a distant, dispassionate sense of an account being settled. Jacob's trial was a formality. With the physical evidence and the damning testimony from both me and Sarah, who spoke of our cousin Mary and the suspicious circumstances of her drowning, his conviction was a certainty. His lawyers tried to paint me as a fantasist and Sarah as a vindictive, estranged sister, but no one was buying the story anymore. The silver locket told its own tale. But my justice hadn't come from the judge's gavel. My true victory had happened in that living room, the moment I saw the mask of his reputation shatter. The trial was merely the epilogue. The annihilation of his good name was the revenge. That was the thing he valued most, and I had taken it from him. In the midst of this public collapse, a quiet alliance was forged. Mrs. Vance, the librarian who had started it all with her quiet act of courage, became a steady, calming presence. She would visit, bringing books and cups of tea, never pressing me to talk, but creating a safe space where I could simply be. And Sarah, my predecessor in trauma, my surprise savior, became my guardian. Haunted by her own past and her guilt over her cousin's fate, she was determined to see me safe. With funds from a life she had built for herself, far from her brother's poisonous influence, she made me an offer. "You can't stay here, Lily," she said to me one afternoon as we sat in the quiet of Mrs. Vance's parlor. "This town is a graveyard of bad memories. You need to go somewhere new, somewhere you can breathe. Let me help you." And so, on a bright, clear morning when the last of the fog had finally burned away, I left Harmony Creek. My belongings fit into a single suitcase. I was leaving behind the girl I was, the ghost I had become, and the family who had betrayed me. I was 16 years old, pregnant, and my future was a terrifying, uncertain blank slate. But for the first time in almost a year, I was free. Sarah drove. Mrs. Vance stood on the sidewalk, waving until we turned the corner. I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time, watching the neat houses of Elm Avenue, the perfect lawns, the white picket fences, shrink until they were gone. I was not sad. I was not happy. I was a soldier, walking away from a scorched and silent battlefield. I had lost so much, but I had survived, and in a war like mine, survival was victory. My garden is my sanctuary. It is a world I have built with my own two hands, a plot of earth where I have spent the last 50 years coaxing life from the soil. The sun is warm on my back this afternoon, and the air is sweet with the scent of lavender and climbing roses. Here, there are no locked doors, no judgmental whispers, no ghosts of the past. There is only the gentle hum of bees, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, and the quiet, steady work of tending to things that grow. I never went back to Harmony Creek. After Sarah drove me away from that town of manicured lawns and buried secrets, I put it behind me like a bad dream. Sarah became my staunchest friend, my fierce protector. With her help, I moved to a small, anonymous town in another state, found a small apartment, and prepared for the arrival of my son, Mrs. Vance wrote to me every week for years, her letters filled with quiet encouragement and news of a world I no longer belonged to. Through her, I heard that my parents lived out their days in the prison of shame they had built for themselves, shunned by the community whose approval they had craved above all else. I never spoke to them again. There was nothing left to say. Forgiveness is a beautiful concept, but it requires repentance, and all they ever repented was getting caught. My revenge was not loud. It was not a single, fiery moment of retribution. The justice system dealt with Jacob Abernathy, and he spent the rest of his miserable life in a cell, but that was the world's justice, not mine. My revenge was quiet, and it was patient. It was the act of living, and living well. It was in every sunrise I watched with a free heart, every book I read without fear, every friendship I forged on the foundation of honesty and trust. It was in every lullaby I sang to my infant son. His name is Samuel. I named him after a prophet, a boy who heard the voice of God when the priests could not. My son, the child born of my darkest moment, became my greatest light. Raising him was my act of defiance against the world that had tried to crush me. I was determined that the cycle of trauma, the poison of my past, would end with me. I would not teach him the fear of shame that had crippled my mother, nor the brittle, tyrannical pride that had hollowed out my father. I would teach him kindness, empathy, and the quiet strength of a gentle heart. A shadow falls over me, and I look up from the stubborn weed I've been trying to coax from the earth. Samuel stands there, smiling, holding out a tall glass of lemonade, condensation trickling down its side. He is in his late 50s now, his hair graying at the temples, but his eyes are the same kind, gentle eyes he has had since he was a boy. "Taking a break, Mom?" he asks, his voice warm. "Just admiring my handiwork," I say, accepting the glass. The lemonade is cool and sweet. He kneels beside me, his large, capable hands effortlessly pulling the weed that had given me so much trouble. We work in comfortable silence for a few moments, a rhythm we have shared for decades. They tried to bury me. They tried to hide me away, to cover the ugliness of their secrets with the dirt of a forced marriage and a lifetime of silence. They didn't know that some things aren't meant to be buried. They didn't know that I was a seed. My son, the boy they wanted to hide away under the name of his abuser, the living evidence of a crime they tried to erase, is a child psychologist. He spends his days in a quiet, sunlit office, not unlike this garden, helping children who have seen the dark places of the world find their voices. He listens to their stories. He believes them. He helps them heal. He takes the poison of the world and transforms it into medicine. That is his legacy. That is my victory. He gets up, brushing the dirt from his knees. The kids will be here soon. They're excited to show you the birdhouse they painted, my grandchildren. My beautiful, happy, safe grandchildren. A joy so profound it feels like a physical ache in my chest. I look at the small table beside my bench. Sitting there is the little porcelain bird I have kept all these years, the one that is a copy of the wooden one he gave me. It has been my reminder, my touchstone to the past, the proof that it was all real. For decades, it was a symbol of my trauma. Then, it became a symbol of my survival. Now, it is simply a story. I reach out and pick it up. Its surface is cool and smooth. I hold it for a moment, then I set it down gently among the flower pots. Its journey with me is over. Samuel smiles, understanding the silent gesture. He offers me his arm, and I take it, letting him help me to my feet. I turn my face to the warm afternoon sun, its light soft on my wrinkled skin. The garden is in full bloom around me. The air is peaceful. I am no longer the frightened girl in the locked room, no longer the ghost haunting the halls of my own life. I am the gardener, and my life against all odds is beautiful.